Cupid's bridal. Yay! But you can't pay the $300 because your bank card only lets you do $100. Well, on moreforafrica.com, you can shop directly on US and UK stores and pay in Naira. No worries on a bank limit. Just log on to More for Africa and download the app. Available on Android, iOS, Google Chrome and Windows. Add funds to your web card from your bank card and pay. In 5 to 15 business days, your order will be delivered to you. More for Africa. Shop global, pick up local.
So today's Top Chef class is in how to rob a bank. And it's clear that the general public needs guidance because the average bank robbery net is $7,500. Rank and nothing about how to fix it. The folks who know, of course, run up our largest bank. And last go round, they cost us over $11 trillion. That's what 11 trillion looks like. That's it cost us over 10 million jobs. So our task is to educate ourselves so that we can understand why we have the current intensifying financial crises and how we can prevent them in the future. And the answer to that is that we have to stop epidemics of control fraud. Control fraud is what happens when the people who control, typically a CEO, seemingly legitimate entities, use it as a weapon to collect fraud. And these are the weapons of mass destruction in the financial world. They also follow in China a particular strategy because the weapon of choice in China, and there is a recipe for control fraud and how it occurs. And we discovered this recipe in quite an odd way that I'll come back to. First ingredient in the recipe, grow like crazy. Second, by making or buying really crappy loans, but loans that are made at a very high interest rate. 3, while employing extreme leverage, that just means a lot of debt compared to your equity. And 4, while providing only trivial loss reserves against the inevitable loss. If you follow those 4 simple steps, and any bank can follow them, then you are mathematically guaranteed to have 3 things occur. The first thing is you will report record bank profits, not just high, record. 2, the CEO will immediately be made incredibly wealthy from modern successes. And 3, farther down the road, the bank will suffer catastrophic losses and will fail unless it is bailed out. And that's how, that's a hint as to how we discovered this recipe. Because we discovered it through an autopsy. During the savings and loan debacle in 1984, we looked at every single failure, and we looked at common characteristics, and we discovered this recipe was common to each of these frauds. In other words, a coroner could find these things because this is a fatal recipe that will destroy the bank as well as the economy. And it also turns out to be precisely what could have stopped this bank. The one that cost us $11 trillion just in the household sector, that cost us 10 million jobs, was the easiest financial crisis by far to have avoided completely if we had simply effectively learned the lessons of epidemics of control fraud, particularly using this recipe. So let's go to this crisis. And the two huge epidemics of loan origination fraud, appraisal fraud and buyer's loans. And what we're going to see in looking at both of these is we got warnings that were incredibly early about these frauds. We got warnings that we could have taken advantage of easily because back in the savings and loan debacle, we had figured out how to respond and prevent these frauds. And three, the warnings were unambiguous. They were obvious that what was going on was an epidemic of accounting control fraud. Take appraisal fraud first. This is simply where you inflate the value of the home that is being pledged as security. In 2000, the year 2000, that is over a year before Enron failed. The honest appraisers got together a formal petition begging the federal government to act and the industry to act to stop this epidemic. And the appraisers explained how it was occurring. That banks were demanding that appraisers inflate the appraisal, and that if the appraisers refused to do so, the banks would blacklist honest appraisers and refuse to use them. Now, we've seen this before in the savings and loan debacle, and we know that this kind of fraud can only originate and that no honest lender would ever include an appraiser because it's the great protection against loss. So this was incredibly clear in 2000. It was something we've seen before, and it was completely unambiguous. This was an epidemic of accounting control fraud led by the banks. What about liars? Well, that warning actually comes earlier. The savings and loan debacle is basically the early 1980s. And in the midst of fighting that wave of accounting control fraud, in 1990, we found that a second front of fraud was being started. And like all good financial frauds in America, it began in Orange County, California. And we happened to be the regional regulators for it. And our examiners said they're making loans without even checking what the borrower's income is. This is insane. It has to lead to massive losses. And it only makes sense for entities engaged in these accounting control frauds. And we said, yeah, you're absolutely right. And we drove those liar loans out of the industry in 1990 and 1991. But we could only deal with the industry we had jurisdiction over, which was savings and loans. And so the biggest and the baddest of the frauds, Long Beach Savings, voluntarily gave up its federal savings and loan charter, gave up federal deposits, converted to become a mortgage bank for the sole purpose of and changed its name to AmeriQuest and became the most notorious of the liar loans frauds early on. And to add to that, they deliberately evaded minorities. So we knew again about this crisis. We'd seen it before. We'd stopped it before. We had incredibly early warnings of it. And it was absolutely unambiguous that no honest lender could make loans in the past. So let's take a look at the reaction of the industry and the regulators and the prosecutors to early warnings that could have prevented the crisis. Start with the industry. The industry responded between 2003 and 2006 by increasing liar's loans by over 500%. These were the loans that hyperinflated the bubble. By 2006, half of all the loans held in subprime were also liar's loans, not mutually exclusive, because together were the most toxic combination even possible. By 2006, 40% of all the loans made that year, all the home loans made that year, were liar's loans. 40%. And this is despite a warning from the industry's own anti-fraud expert that said that these loans were an open invitation to fraud, and that they had a fraud incidence of 90%. 90. In response to that, the industry first started calling these loans liar's loans, which lacks a certain subtlety. And second, massively increased them. And no government regulator ever required or encouraged any lender to make a liar's loan or anyone to purchase a liar's loan in that explicitly increased. This came from the lenders because of the fraud recipe, right? What happened to appraisal fraud? It expanded remarkably as well. By 2007, through a survey of appraisers, 90% of appraisers reported that they've been subject to coercion from the lenders trying to get them to inflate an appraisal. In other words, both forms of fraud became absolutely endemic and normal, and this is what drove the problem. What happened in the governmental sector? Well, the government, as I told you, when we were the savings and loan regulators, we could only deal with our industry. And if people gave up their federal deposit insurance, we couldn't do anything. Congress, like it was impossible, but actually did something intelligent in 1994 and passed the Home Ownership Equity Protection Act that gave the Fed, and only the Federal Reserve, the explicit statutory authority to ban liar's loans by every lender, whether or not they had public insurance. So what did Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan, as chairs of the Fed, do when they got these warnings that these were massively fraudulent and that they were being sold to the secondary market? Remember, there's no fraud exorcist. Once it starts out a fraudulent loan, it can only be sold to the secondary market through more frauds, lying about the reps and warranties. And then those people are going to produce mortgage-backed securities and exotic derivatives, which are also going to be supposedly backed by those frauds. So the fraud is going to progress through the entire system, hyperinflate the bubble, produce a disaster. And remember, we had experience with this. We had seen significant losses, and we had experience of competent regulators in Greenspan and used the authority under the statute to stop liar's loans. And this was a matter first of dogma, or just, horrifically opposed to anything regulatory, but it is also the international competition in laxity, the race to the bottom between the United States and the United Kingdom, the City of London in particular. And the City of London won that race to the bottom, but it meant that all regulation in the West was completely degraded, and the stupid competition to stupid about the weakest regulation. So that was the regulatory. What about the response of the prosecutors after the crisis, after $11 trillion in losses, after 10 million jobs lost, a crisis in which the losses and the frauds were more than 70 times larger than the savings and loan debacle. Well, in the savings and loan debacle, our agency that regulated savings and loans, OCS, made over 30,000 criminal referrals, produced over 1,000 felony convictions just in cases designated as major, and that understates the authority. Because we worked with the FBI to create the list of the top 100 fraud schemes, absolute worst of the worst, roughly 300 savings and loans involved, roughly 600 senior officials. Virtually all of them were prosecuted. We had a 90% greatest success when we caught white collar criminals. And it was because of this understanding of control fraud and the accounting control fraud mechanism. Flash forward to the same agency, is supposed to regulate many of the largest makers of liar's loans in the country. It has made, even today, as of a year ago, it had made zero. The Office of Comptroller of Currency, which is supposed to regulate the largest national banks, has made zero criminal referrals. The Fed appears to have made zero criminal referrals. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is smart enough to refuse. Without any guidance from the regulator, there's no expertise in FBI. It isn't simply that they had to reinvent the wheel of how to do these prosecutions. They've forgotten that the wheel exists. And therefore we have zero prosecutions, of course, zero convictions of any of the elite bank fraud and Wall Street. With no expertise coming from the regulators, the FBI formed what it called a partnership with the Mortgage Bankers Association is the trade association. And the Mortgage Bankers Association set out, it had the audacity and the success to con the FBI. It had created a supposed definition of mortgage fraud in which, guess what, its members are always the victim and never the perpetrators. And the FBI has bought this hook, line, sinker, rod, reel, and the boat they rode out in. And so the FBI, under the leadership of an Attorney General who is African American and a President of the United States who is African American, have adopted this two-party definition of the crisis in which it is the first virgin crisis in history conceived without sin in the executive branch. And it's those so clever hairdressers who are able to defraud the poor, pitiful banks who lack any financial capacity. It is the silliest story you can conceive of. And so they go and they prosecute the hairdressers. And they leave the banksters alone entirely. So while lions are roaming the campsite, the FBI is chasing mice. What do we need to do? What can we do? We need to change the first percentage structure that produced the current epidemic accounting control fraud. So we have to first get rid of the systemically dangerous so-called shrink them in the next 5 years that they no longer pose a systemic risk. Right now, they are ticking time bombs that will cause a global crisis. Second thing we need to do is complete true reform on executive, which is what they use to warn the appraisers. Remember, there was pressure in the appraisers to the compensation system. They're trying to how the fraud became endemic. And the third thing that we need to do is deal with what we call public deregulation, the key factor. Because we can make all three of these things. And if we do so, we can dramatically reduce how often we have a crisis and how severe those crises are. That is not simply critical to us. What these crises do to inequality and what they do to crony capitalism Americans, in which the largest financial institutions of both parties. And that's the reason why even after this crisis, 70 times larger than the savings and loan crisis, we have no meaningful reform in any of the three areas that I've talked about, other than which is good, but that's just one form of ammunition for this fraud weapon. There are many forms of ammunition that we use. That's why we need who are dependent on political contributions will not do it on their own. Thank you very much.